Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to another stream with me, Adam Cowley. I'm a developer relations engineer at Neo4j. So today's stream is coming at a slightly earlier time. And what I want to do today is I want to go through the new role-based access control features that are in Neo4j 4.1. So this blog post appeared on on neo4j.com today. And essentially this is going through the new features of Neo4j 4.1. So 6 months after we released 4.0, the 4.1 is now available. So this blog post here has a list of all of the features that are inside Neo4j 4.1, all of the improvements that we've done. But the one I want to focus on today is this role-based access control and granular security. So to give you a little bit of background in terms of Neo4j and access control. So in version, I think it's 3.1, we got the introduction of native roles inside Neo4j. So you had a user would be able to log in. So for example, your Neo4j user. But these native roles allowed you to dictate what those users could do. So for example, a reader only has read-only access all the way up to an admin that can do everything, including creating schema constraints and indexes and things like that. And the way that was administered in 3.x was through procedures. So for example, you would call dbms.security.createUser to create a user, and then you would assign them to a role. That changed in version 4.0, where we had the introduction of cipher commands that would allow you to create users and roles. So, for example, we have this the create user role, and what that would allow you to do is just create a user with a name. So instead of calling the procedure, you called a cipher query instead. And so in version 4.0, we also had this some basic grant and deny for access control. So for example, you could grant the ability to traverse, read, and match on a graph. But what has been added into 4.1 is extra abilities now for write syntax as well. So you can, rather than just being able to control what you can read, you can also control what the user writes. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to go through this blog post that I've written and was published today on role-based access control. So if you go to medium.com/neo4j, you should be able to find this and a lot more articles on Neo4j. And this is one of many streams that will be going out this week, based around the features of 4.1. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to work through a worked example. So the official documentation itself gives you a walkthrough of fine-grained access control from a healthcare point of view. So we have patients' symptoms and diseases, and patients have are diagnosed with a disease. And depending on the user and depending on the role, different people are given access to different things. I'm going to put a slightly different spin on this. I'm going to look at the Northwind example. So if you go to the developer guides and under data import, there's IDBMS to graph guide. So this guides you through the importing of the Northwind dataset. So that's the dataset I remember back from college. So it was kind of a dataset that taught you how to use Microsoft Access. So it consists of customers who place orders. Those orders have details, and then they order products. There's also information around suppliers and employees, which we're not going to go into too much detail about today, but it's a really interesting use case. So this guide will walk you through how to import the data into Neo4j. So essentially, there's a browser guide which you can run. by using this command. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and create a new version of Neo4j 4.1. So the 4.1 is not available at the moment in Neo4j Desktop, but I'm using Neo4j Desktop Canary. So it's the latest version of Neo4j Desktop, the dev version. So if you want to use it right now, then download Neo4j Desktop Canary. Otherwise, it should be released a little bit later in the week. Cool. There's my database there of Northwind. So while that's starting up, I'll go through a little bit through this. So the way the model works is you have a customer which purchased orders, and then those orders contain relationships to one or more products. And then those products are part of categories, and they're also supplied by a supplier. So the spin I'm going to put on this essentially coming up with like a scenario around GDPR. So if the information around a customer or their orders was leaked for any reason, then this could be a nightmare for GDPR purposes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create create a new user and then create some constraints around what they can and can't do. So first, if I go through and run the play card, what we'll do is we will browser. So what I'll do is I'll go through and walk through the play card very briefly. So it's code and play and then Northwind. Cool. So essentially what it's saying is that it's a step-by-step process through importing the Northwind dataset. So this uses CSV files, so you can imagine that these files have been exported from a relational database of your choice into CSV file and then imported in. So essentially the first one, for anyone who hasn't seen this before, the load CSV command takes a CSV file and then converts it into Neo4j types inside the Cypher type system. So we're saying that load CSV with the headers from this file here. So if we take a quick look at this, we can see that there's a product that has a product name, a supplier ID, category ID, quantities, unit prices, and things like that. So we're not going to be too interested in all the information inside there, but we'll import it in either way. So what we're doing is we're saying load CSV from that file, and then we're assigning it to a variable of row, creating a new product node, so a node alias of m with a label of product. And then this is a mass assignment to say that for every item inside that row map, then set that as a property on this n node. And then, so by default, when you import things inside load CSV, everything is a string. So what these 3 lines at the bottom are doing is just casting the data into the correct format. So the unit price is a float. So I would just take that and then convert it into a float with decimal points. And then everything is to integers. And then this discontinued is a Boolean. So I'll load that data in. The next one is then importing the categories. So again, we'll take this row. So we've got a description there, we've got the category name, we've got the ID, and we've got a picture there as well. And if we run that, then that will create that data. And the same with suppliers as well. So if we take a look at that. Then we have a country, we have a supplier ID, we have an address, contact title, etc. Cool. And then next we're creating some indexes. So what the indexes do is they give you a starting point of a query. So for example, if I say match p products, return p limit 10. So if I take, for example, these this one here, so we've got Northwood's cranberry sauce, which is the product name there. So when you run a query inside Neo4j, what it will do is it will use some sort of index or some scan to load to find the starting point in the traversal. And then what it will do is it will traverse out through the relationships from there. So by creating the indexes, it means that we can easily identify a individual product. So for example, on the product ID, we can go straight to product ID 8 rather than having to look through all of the nodes in the database. Cool. And then we create some relationships between the products and the category. So this is sort of like denormalizing the data in a way. Calculating joins and then putting them in there. So then when we actually query the data, we can do that by using the Neo4j adjacency in real time rather than having to compute those at query time. So that's really the benefit of Neo4j really, is to query things in using the Neo4j adjacency, and you basically pointer chasing in memory rather than having to compute join tables and compute things in memory as the query runs. So if we take a look here, so we can see that we're finding all the suppliers and the products and categories, and then returning the name of the company and the categories that they sell in. So that's great. We've got some data in there now. Perfect. So then for the customers, again, we're doing the same thing. So from the customers.csv file, creating a customer and then setting the everything inside that row map as a property. Same with orders, and then creating the constraints and indexes on those, creating the relationship between them, and again with the order details as well. Cool. So if we take a look at the schema. So now we can see that we have a customer which has purchased an order. That order has orders relationships to products. Product is supplied by a supplier, so a supplier supplies that product, and that product is part of a category. So that's the data that we have in there. So if we take one example, so we go for a customer. So that's customer. Let's get the company name. So I'm not going to try and pronounce that, but we've got this customer, which is then created this order, and then the order contains these 4 products. So for example, this product Rombrow. It's ordered by many other people as well, but it's part of the beverages category. And then there's a supplier in there as well. So that's supplied by Martin Bain. Cool. So if we go back to the example of this sensitive information, so there may be a case that you have many different types of users that need to access the application at any time. So I've drawn out some users here that may potentially want to access the data. So for example, if we have some application servers that connect to Neo4j using the official drivers, they should only be allowed to do certain things. So for example, that should be able to read all of the data from the website. So you should have access to all of the customer information to allow them to log in. You want a full view of the products and the categories, so the user can browse the site. And they should also be able to create new orders. So creating the order nodes, and then the relationships between the orders and the products and the customers, and even the customers themselves. So if a customer signs up, then the application should be able to add that. But just in case anything could go wrong, maybe you've got some hackers on the site or something like that. You want to restrict them from doing certain things. So they don't really want read access to the products and the categories and the suppliers. There's no reason for that website user to access those. So for the same sort of thing for suppliers as well. So if imagine we had a supplier application, or maybe we supply suppliers with their own credentials to access the database and then allow them to create their own products and category listings, then we should allow them to do that, but they shouldn't have access to anything else. And then, for example, like a data science team should be able to access the products and the orders, but without having any access to the customer details themselves. So what we can do is we can use these new features, the features from 4.0, to restrict the access to the reading of data to these users, and then we can use the new features of 4.1 to restrict the data that any particular user or group is allowed to write to the database. So what we can do is we can run a command to create a new user. So actually, one of the notes that I have on this blog post is that previously you had to do :use system in order to switch to the system database to run system commands. But actually, as of 4.1, it's now clever enough to know that's a system command and then pass it through to the system database. We don't need to worry too much about that. But what I'll do is I'll create a new user for the website. So to do that, I use the create user command, and then let's call that website. Set the initial password for the user. Let's just say let me in for now. And then we say that the change is not required. Cool. And if I say show users, so I can now see that we have the Neo4j user that we're logged in at the moment, which has a role of admin and a role of public, and this new website user that we've created with a role of public. So this public role is a new feature of 4.1, and it's basically a way of allowing you to assign certain privileges to everybody in the database. So this is when you create a new user, it's automatically given the public role, and it's inherited by every database and every user by default. So it can be modified, and you can change the privileges that this public role has, but it can be removed. So back in February, I wrote this blog post about this fictional company called Vendor Power. So Vendor Power is a fictional company that sells software as a service products to clients and allows them to view and track sales opportunities. So it may be similar to something you use inside your business. It's definitely something we use inside ours. Essentially, the reason for this blog post was to demonstrate the features of firstly multi-tenancy, but also the built-in roles and how you can keep the data safe and segregated. So the idea behind the use case is that every time a customer signs up for Vendor Power, then a new database is created inside Neo4j, so a new multi-tenancy database created inside Neo4j, and then a set of seeding scripts, so Cypher scripts, are run to create the initial environment for that user. So what I had to do inside this blog post, or in order to get this to work, was to create a customer role. Create role customer, and essentially what this did is this acted as a way of for me to be able to restrict the access for everybody. So what I would do is for each of those customers, sorry, for each of the users that has that customer role, I would deny access to the database customers, which is where the overarching customer information was held. And then every time I created a database, so I created a new database with the name of the customer, and then I would deny access to the customer, which was this public role, and then create a new user with the same name as the name, and then grant the role of customer, so it wouldn't have access to all of the other customer roles, but then create a custom one, which would then allow it to access that, access their individual database. So that's a long-winded way of saying that this public role now allows us to do that. So by default, that role is there, so we don't have to create our own one for that for users. And what we can do is we can use that to restrict the access and grant the access that we want everybody to have. So, for example, now I have this user. If I now connect as that user, so username, website, and then the password was let me in. So now I've logged into the database. I've got access to Neo4j, which is the default database. That's the default system behavior. But right now I don't have access to that Northwind database that we've created. So what I need to do is I need to explicitly allow that. So what I'll do is I'll create that using Cypher shell in Neo4j terminal. So if you click Open Terminal, what it does is it opens up a terminal window inside the root of this database. So I've got, for example, the bin folder, which has all of the binary files in there, the import folder, the config, and the data. So inside the bin folder, I've got Cypher shell, which is what I'm interested in. So I can log in with my username and password. So this is the admin user. And what it will do is it will go and it will connect to the database and then connect to the default one. So if I say show databases, so I can see I've now got that Neo4j in the system. Okay. But for this, so for this user again, so we don't have any, we have no node labels there, no relationship types there, so we don't have any access to that database. So what I can do now is, because I want essentially every user should have read access to products and category nodes inside the database. What I can do is I can grant access to those nodes. So if we take a look at this, so we've got grant the privilege name on graphs to a role. So in this case, what I want to do is I want to grant access to that user. So grant access on graph Neo4j, and then I want to define the nodes that are allowed to see. So the labels on the nodes, so they should be allowed to see the product and the category nodes to public. No, sorry. So the first thing I want to do is to grant access on graph Neo4j to the public role. On database Neo4j to public. There we go. Cool. So now if I, for example, if I call, if I refresh the database, so I've now got access to this database. But if I call db.schema.visualization to see what's in the database, I've got nothing in there at the moment because I still don't have access to access those nodes. So if I now in this case grant the ability to match, and I want to match everything on graph Neo4j. Now I'm specifying the nodes, so for the product and category nodes to public, and it tells me everything is fine. So now if I refresh this, I've now got the categories there, and I've got the products. So I can match on a category, and I can see the information about the category. So all of the properties there. So I did the grant match star. So inside here you can provide a comma delimited list of all of the properties that you're interested in. So you can access everything on those nodes, but right now if I double click, for example, there's no relationships between them, and there's no relationship types there. The reason for this is because the user doesn't have access to traverse these nodes yet. So in order to do this, there's a graph privilege called traverse. So if I say I want to grant traverse on the graph Neo4j, and I can specify the relationships. So for example, part of is the relationship that we have between the product and the category. Let's say to public. Now if I call db.schema.visualization again, or if I refresh this, so now I've got that the product is now part of the category. So now if I double click on one of these nodes, yeah, it should give me the relationships, which is perfect. So because that's granted to the public user, then that is available to everybody. So if I create a new user or create a new role, then that will be available for them. Cool. So the next step then is to restrict the rights or allow rights. So for example, if I try to create a category node, I will get an error. So create node with the labels category is not allowed for the user website with these roles. So that makes sense. So by default, there's no way to create the create nodes inside the database. You have to be explicit about that. So instead of assigning this ability to the public role, which is not what we want, what we should do instead is we should create a new role and then assign the user to the role. So in order to create the role, you use the create role command, and let's call this just website user. And then if I grant role website user to website, and then I can, for example, I can say like show roles to give me the list of the roles. So I've got these, the public role, the admin architect, so all the ones that are built in. We've also got this website user here. So if I say show roles with users, I can see that for the public role, we've got 3 users in there. So 2 users. So Neo4j and this website user that I've created. But for this website user, there's one, which is website. So now that we know that that user is part of that role, we can now start to assign some more details to them. So by default, the public role only has access to products and to categories. But another thing that the website user will need is access to customers and orders as well. So if I say, for example, we grant a match on everything to the customer and order nodes to website user. So grant match and then everything on graph Neo4j nodes customer order to website user, and then I refresh this visualization. I should now have these two new nodes in there. So I've got the customer there and I've got the order. Cool. So the next thing to do on there is to grant the traverse on the relationships. So grant traverse on graph Neo4j. So the relationships will be purchased and orders to website user. Cool. Refresh this again. And I've now got this whole chain there. So the customer purchase an order, which is an order of products, which is part of a category. Perfect. So we can check the privileges that the user has by using the show user command. So if I say show user website privileges, then we can see there that everything that has been granted for that user. So they have access to the default database through the role of public, and then the match of all the properties on category and products based on public. And you can see that these are the new privileges that we've granted for the website user role. So they can see the customer nodes, order nodes, and then relationships of orders and purchased. It's cool. So now if I run a query on that to test it, so the customer, and let's pick a specific user. So purchased an order, which orders a product, which is part of a category. Let's take the first 10 of those paths. So we can see that all of the data is there, which is great. But we still can create the data for that user. So this user should have access to, so for example, to create to create an order, for example. So if I run create order at the moment, it will tell me that the user, which has these two roles of public and website user, doesn't have access to create those orders. So in order to do that, we can grant the create privileges. So on graph Neo4j node order to website user. So now if I refresh that the query again, or run that again, it now lets me do that, which is exactly what we want it to do. Cool. So if I run a crate now with properties on there, it won't let me do that at the moment because right now I don't have the privileges to do that. So I'm not able to set the property order ID based on my roles. So you have to be explicit about the roles that you can set as well. So there are essentially there are two ways of doing this. We can be explicit about the properties that we do allow them to set. So, for example, we could be explicit about the fact that they could set the customer ID or the ship city and things like that. But that may cause problems as we move ahead. So, say for example, there's a new field is added to the database, and we forget to update the privileges, then that could bring down the whole website, which isn't great. So what we can do instead is we can use the wildcard in order to allow everything, and then instead we should restrict what we don't want the user to edit. So, say for example, we have a couple of different systems that access the database. So all of this information, like the where it's shipped to, the customer ID and things like that, we should let them access that information. But there may be other things inside the database that we don't want them to access. So, for example, let's take the employee ID and then the ship date. So we don't want the user role to update those explicitly because we have like another back office process that does that for us. So instead, what we can do is we can grant the create on everything, and then grant set on everything, and then be restrictive on what they can't set instead. So, for example, I can say so grant set. So the privilege is set property, and then we say all of them on graph Neo4j. Nodes order to the website user. Cool. And then we can deny the set of the properties of employee ID and ship date on graph Neo4j. Nodes order to website user. Then if I check that again, check the privileges, we can now see that the extra information is there. So we have we can create an element and we can set all of the properties, but then it will restrict the properties that we add. So if I try and do that, for example, and create one with order ID of 99999. Won't let me do that. Okay, so one thing to remember inside Neo4j is that the property properties and labels. So all of the data that you add into Neo4j is actually case sensitive. So I've got lowercase o there in order. So that's why that's not working. So nodes order to website user. So similarly, the roles and usernames are case sensitive as well. Right. So if I try that again, then it's added the database. But if I add the employee ID, sorry, that's my mistake. So I've so granted everything there, and then I want to restrict the employee ID and the ship date. Cool. So deny set property of employee ID or ship date on the graph Neo4j with the node's order to the website user. Perfect. So if I run this again, perfect. So now because I've tried to set both of those properties and it doesn't allow me to set the employee ID, then it will return back a forbidden error. Cool. Okay. If, for example, you do make any mistakes, like I have done here, what you can do is you can use the revoke command to revoke the revoke a permission that you've granted. So, for example, if I take this with the lowercase order, so I can say, for example, revoke deny set property. Okay, let's ignore that for now. Yeah, so you should be able to revoke. Let's see why that's not working. So it's from rather than to. So you grant them to, and then you revoke it from. Kind of makes sense. Cool. So yeah, so now we can see that's been removed there. So essentially, it's a way of removing something. If you have any make any mistakes, then you can just revoke those. So one, I guess one thing to mention as well, if you're doing anything on the public role, you kind of need to be careful. So one of the things that I found is that when adding things to the public role, if I made a mistake, it would cascade across to everybody. So in theory, you could provide some sort of access to every user by accident, or there may be some unintended side effects. So just something to be aware of. So that's like a small subset of the commands that are available. So inside the blog post, there's a whole list of everything that you can do. So based on the old users, I've split these out. So these are the new things that have been added. So for read-only access, there's grant access, and then there's grant match to the role. In terms of the editor, so the editor has read access to everything, plus like the limited ability to write to the graph. So you can create a node with properties that are there already, but it won't let you create anything new. So I guess the example that I always give to people with this is that if you've got like a new developer that's joined the team and they're not used to the naming conventions that you've got, it can be really easy to add like bad data into Neo4j. So employee ID with a uppercase D and a lowercase d will be different. So you just need to be sort of careful about that. Giving them the editor privilege will stop that from happening. So the publisher has all of that ability, but also has the ability to create new keys and to create constraints. So for example, here we have the grant name management, which allows you to create new keys. The architect has the ability to do all that, but also gives you the ability to create constraints and indexes. So, for example, grant index management to a particular user, or grant constraint management. Without that, they won't be able to create constraints. And then for anybody or any role that you want to give admin access to, so you've got DBMS privileges, so the ability to update the DBMS, the database management system. So, for example, adding a user. The database privileges is all around creating the databases and graphs. And then the transaction management means that a user can kill somebody else's transaction. So by default, you can only kill your own transactions, but with this permission, then you can kill other people's transactions as well. So that's everything from me today. So if there's any for further reading, there's this role-based access control in Neo4j 4.1 blog post. So if you go to medium.com/Neo4j, it should be somewhere near the top of the list. You take a look at the Cypher manual entry on subgraph security. So that gives you more detail on the controls themselves. Or if you want a worked example, then you can go through the authorization access control page on the operations manual, and that's the one that gives you the healthcare example. If anybody has any questions, any comments, any feedback, then feel free to get in touch. My name is Adam Cowley on Twitter, or you can join the Neo4j community website, start a conversation there at community.neo4j.com. Otherwise, enjoy your afternoons, and we'll speak soon.